Okay, in my work, I support people as both a dietitian and a coach. And a few weeks ago, after a pretty heavy call with a client, I made my way outside to put my feet on the earth and ground. Within a few moments, I found myself face down in the grass, just as I had been many times before. It reminded me about the garden. It reminded me about the garden. Yeah? Garden. It's not working. Okay. It reminded me about the garden and where I'd spend my summers as a child in Michigan. As a 4-year-old, in the delightful Midwestern summers, I would lay belly to belly with the earth for hours on end. I'd get lost in the incredible shapes and patterns of nature. I'd stare at the little roly-polies crawling around, and I would feel peace. To a passerby, it would have appeared as a child playing innocently in the yard. From the perspective of my parents, somehow, I was being entertained. To many people in this room, with slightly more context, it would have been evident that I was dissociating. And to me, it just felt good. Those long hours in the yard, playing house under the pine tree, and princess in the shrubs saved my life. It gave me a place to go that felt very different from the norm. It felt soothing, peaceful, and safe. It would be roughly 30 years before I discover what I was really doing in the garden and what I was dissociating from. But just before my 5th birthday, in the fall, I started kindergarten, and those long adventures in the yard became no longer. Fortunately, for my young self, I discovered an alternative. Candy! Fun Dip and Jolly Ranchers and Starbursts and Blow Pops and Sour Patch Kids were my favorite. They were fun and yummy and delicious and pleasurable and very distracting. Enchanting, really. Candy took me, just like the grass did, to another place, a better place. And just like that, food quickly became what I reached for all the time. When I was bored, when I was upset, when I was anxious, afraid, you name the trigger, the answer was food. So much so that right after high school, this thing with food developed into a full-blown eating disorder. And 4 years later, at 22 years old, I checked myself into a recovery center for bulimia and binge eating disorder. And while I received a lot from that experience, what no one seemed to notice that soon became curious to me was that this thing with food, this super compulsive energy around food, this feeling of being hijacked by a need to eat, this eating to the point of sickness, was coming from a deeper driver. The team at the facility was interested in triggers and behavioral modification tools, but I became curious about what was triggering the trigger. What was behind this seemingly uncontrollable force, and why the hell could I not stop eating? Even years after treatment, when I decided to explore the field of nutrition professionally, first, admittedly, with a motive of learning how to hack my body with proper nutrition so I could be thin and happy, as the lie goes, and then eventually falling in love with the field of functional medicine and pursuing a title as a functional dietitian, I still struggled with food. I remember the frustration I felt as I was studying for finals my senior year with a brand new elimination diet prescribed to me by a functional practitioner in an attempt to alleviate my severe gastrointestinal symptoms and endocrine dysfunction, both of which were exacerbated by the consumption of outrageous amounts of sugar, because let's face it, no one binges on broccoli. I realized that if I didn't get to the root of this food thing, I would never heal my body, because avoiding those kinds of foods, even though I knew it would help me, it felt impossible. So, turns out, I share this path of emotional eating with many. The statistics are overwhelming for the amount of people engaging in similar patterns. Not necessarily those diagnosed with eating disorders per se, but if we consider the staggering obesity rates, statistics around weight-related conditions like hypertension and diabetes, we can infer that many of us are eating past the point of nourishment, perpetually overriding our physiological hunger and fullness cues. So why? Diabetics aren't losing limbs because they like the taste of food. Bariatric patients who undergo surgery only to regain the weight plus aren't suffering like this because food tastes good. I wasn't eating compulsively because I lacked information about nutrition or because I was physically hungry. So what's going on? In a recent and compelling study, researchers explored and identified various functions of binge eating on participants with self-reported binge eating disorder. Some of those functions, or what we could call reasons for binge eating, include numbness and dissociation, control, hedonic hunger or eating for pleasure, emotional regulation, emotional suppression, self-protection, and self-punishment. Who thinks we have a problem here? Researchers then explored the associations between these reasons for binge eating and various adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And they found correlation between certain events or traumas one had experienced in childhood and corresponding reasons they would engage in emotional eating or binge eating. For example, of the 882 participants, 74% of them engaged in binge eating for reasons of hedonic hunger and had experienced childhood emotional neglect. Essentially, when these participants were children, their emotional needs were not acknowledged, validated, or processed in a healthy way, and so they learned to seek pleasure, comfort, and dare I say nurturance in food. Of these same participants, 55% of them engaged in binge eating for reasons of both hedonic hunger and self-punishment. Self-punishment and numbness and dissociation, also associated with childhood emotional neglect. The participants who ate for reasons of control, seeking ways to assert their autonomy through their food choices, had experienced childhood sexual abuse, where they had no control. As did the participants who ate for reasons of self-protection, possibly eating in such a way to make themselves feel less physically attractive and therefore less vulnerable to future violation. What this study so powerfully illustrates is that there are some serious emotional and psychological reasons behind, or drivers behind, the reasons we reach for food. And that these reasons are deeply rooted in trauma and how we learned as little ones to cope with it. Now, sometimes these reasons are known and conscious. We're aware of the kinds of experiences or the kinds of things we lived through in childhood, but can't necessarily interrupt the patterns we use to soothe from them. And other times, these reasons are unknown, buried deeply in the subconscious mind, placed there in a protective fashion by a survival-based phenomenon called dissociation, leading to repressed memories. Now, I'm not a psychotherapist, and so I'm not going to delve into the science around this, but I will share elements of my own lived experience. As I've mentioned, from the time I was a little girl, I had a very emotionally charged relationship with food, but I had no idea why. I lacked a reference point of life prior to the development of that pattern. So that was the only coping tool I had access to in moments of need. As you can imagine, as I got older, in the absence of healthy coping mechanisms, many facets of my life were greatly impacted. My relationships, and most notably, the relationship with myself, was in complete shambles. Relating period felt highly uncomfortable, and I spent most of my time in isolation. It was this, and a podcast discussing the healing potentials of psychedelics, that eventually drove me towards the path of self-discovery. In the summer of 2020, while the rest of the world was experiencing its own very challenging ceremony of sorts, I too found myself sitting for the first time with ayahuasca. In the second of 3 ceremonies, I had experienced incredible beauty and was flying so high. Towards the end of the ceremony, as I opened my eyes, I found myself laying on my belly. Now, this ceremony was held in a forest, and so once again, my forehead was inches from the earth. The patterns on the dried leaves, the moss growing on stones and twigs, the ants marching, it was all strangely familiar and deeply captivating. And just like Alice, I fell into a gnarly rabbit hole. I experienced the feeling of falling. I was flipping over and over and over. I grew incredibly nauseous. I started sweating. My throat started closing, and fractal images began to appear. Fortunately, a few seconds later, I heard the sound of the gong, indicating that ceremony was over and that we could leave and head back to our rooms to get some rest because the final ceremony was later that night. Rest was not an option for me. I was so sick to my stomach, I couldn't even swallow water. Despite many attempts of trying to talk myself out of it, and a big thanks to my brave ass higher self, I drank the medicine again that night. And there, under the full moon, I discovered what was at the bottom of that rabbit hole. I learned what I had been dissociating from in the garden. I learned what I was doing in the garden many years before. I learned that I was repeatedly molested as a very young child. And in that moment, with zero prior recollection, my entire life made sense. No wonder I had carried such deep shame. No wonder I couldn't tolerate feeling anything. No wonder I abused myself, and no wonder I hid from the world. Nothing and no one made sense. I felt safe, except for food. No wonder, sweet child. An endless well of self-compassion opened, and my life began to change forever. Learning my story put me on the path of freedom. It allowed me to see the reasons I had behaved the ways I had for so long. It allowed the narratives of worthlessness and disgust to begin to fall away, being replaced by gentleness, compassion, and a deep desire for liberation. What happened that night was that for the first time in my life, I was able to see and feel what I had been using food to push down for so long. What if the vast majority of people suffering with their weight, addicted to substances, or engaging in other dissociative patterns aren't the ways they are for any of the reasons that society has projected upon them, but rather because they are carrying so much pain, they are just trying, from a nervous system perspective, to survive. And why survive? Because feeling the things we've been avoiding feels scary. Feeling the things that were once threatening to our well-being and potentially our lives feels like death. But what if we have it all backwards? What if the pain we're afraid of feeling, the pain we feel may kill us, sweep us into a hellish abyss where we will be no longer, aren't pains of death, but birthing pains? What if everything we're avoiding feeling are the very things that piece by piece brings us back to life? What if the feelings itself are our very truth coming forth, and every time we're brave enough to feel, we become more and more alive, more and more free, and more our truest selves? You see, the real epidemic, in my opinion, isn't that of obesity, narcotic addiction, or fill in the blank. The real epidemic is numbness. It's a fear of feeling. It's the very reason we reach for these substances in the first place. What will I find in there? How will I have to change my entire life? What will these feelings do to me and everything I think I know? Many of us subscribe to the cliche that ignorance is bliss, but how blissful is it to be on insulin, statins, or diuretics, to be winded as we walk up the stairs or try to play with our children? How blissful is it to stay in on a Saturday night when we really want to meet someone and fall in love, but we're embarrassed by the way we look and decide to hide instead? How blissful is it to jeopardize relationships and job opportunities because we can't put the bottle down even though we desperately want to? Ignorance isn't bliss. Ignorance is numbness. And ignorance is highly uncomfortable. But so is learning our truth and feeling our pain. At least this flavor of discomfort offers so much more. What became available to me because I was willing to look and feel instead of continuing to numb is that for the first time in my life, I am deeply connected to myself. I have incredible relationships. I have friends, mentors, and teachers. I have a thriving practice where I get to serve the most epic humans. I have love and joy and laughter, and I am here speaking with all of you in service of our precious freedom. And that frees me. I'm here because psychedelics were the catalyst that fundamentally changed my life. They helped me out of deep suffering, and I am so profoundly grateful and so lit the hell up. So lit up by how these teachers, tools, and allies can radically impact not only our mental and emotional health, but how they can absolutely help heal our physical health as well, because they are no different. In my practice, I see clients who come to me after they've tried everything to lose weight. They're exhausted, frustrated, inflamed, and have multiple health diagnoses, but at the root of it all, they're deeply disconnected from themselves and their bodies, using food or substances to avoid feeling and then resenting that they do so. What I've witnessed repeatedly is that over time, and with the use of psychedelics, and specifically ketamine, they begin to cultivate safety within themselves to start feeling again. Ketamine enables them to access challenging emotions while simultaneously allowing them to experience their own capacity of being with discomfort instead of numbing it away. With my support, we begin to nurture this expanded tolerance, and soon their relationship with food and feelings begins to transform. They learn to view this dance with food not as something they're frustrated by or wish would just go away, but rather as their built-in siren of truth. Each time they feel compelled to emotionally eat, there is an internal alarm going off, signifying to them that there is an unmet need or there is something they are unwilling to feel. If we can identify the needs we are trying to meet superficially with food or other substances, we can then learn how to meet these needs ourselves, becoming the patient and nurturing caretakers that we've always needed but didn't have. With the help of psychedelics, we begin to give ourselves permission to feel. And weight loss and healing happens naturally because weight loss is a byproduct of self-care. When we are caring for ourselves, we are patiently tuning in to the feelings in our bodies, no longer using anything to push it down. I began using psychedelics in my work because through my own journey, I realized that the root cause of weight gain, illness, and suffering wasn't a lack of knowledge, discipline, or willpower. It wasn't even the perfect diet or a lack of the perfect diet, and I'm a dietitian. The root cause of weight gain is trauma. And psychedelics are incredibly powerful tools to help us access and heal from these wounds. They allow us to unearth the trauma that has wreaked havoc in our bodies. Not that one. They allow us to unearth the trauma that has wreaked havoc in our bodies. And what I've experienced personally, what my clients have experienced, is downregulation of our nervous system, drastic improvement in gut health, the remission of certain conditions, weight loss, weaning off medications, more energy, and better sleep. But so much more. We've also opened ourselves up to more joy, more adventure, more connection, more intimacy, more pleasure, more play, and way more fun. We can't selectively numb, my friends. When we numb the pain and the sorrow, we also numb the joy and the love. And so, my invitation is that we begin to shift the ways that we see the things that seem scary to feel. And instead of avoiding them out of fear, we begin to see them as what stands in the way of our most expansive freedom. My invitation is that we have the courage to feel. Because when we are in our bodies, feeling our feelings, accessing our truths, and honoring ourselves, we're able to honor humanity and the planet because we are one. And who knows? Who knows where that will lead you? Just like Alice, when I fell into the rabbit hole, danced with a Mad Hatter, and faced off with a Red Queen, I was blessed to land safely in Wonderland. Thank you.